You might notice it tonight when you step out of a hot shower. For a split second, as the room temperature air hits your damp skin, you feel a tiny, involuntary shiver. It's a small ripple in your muscles, a brief tightening of the chest that passes the moment you grab a towel. You probably don't give it a second thought. It's just a mundane, quiet quirk of being a human being. But that tiny shiver is actually a ghost. It is a biological echo of a war that your ancestors fought for nearly 200,000 years. A war where the enemy wasn't a predator or a rival tribe, but the very air itself. We are soft, tropical animals. We are essentially hairless, walking water balloons that evolved in the sweltering heat of the African Rift Valley. On paper, we have absolutely no business surviving a single night in a sub-zero landscape, let alone thriving through an era where glaciers the size of skyscraper stacks sat on top of the world. Yet, here you are, shivering in a climate-controlled house because the hallway is 5 degrees cooler than the bathroom. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? How did a species designed for the savanna manage to conquer the frost? If we want to understand the scale of this victory, we have to travel back about 100,000 years. At this point in deep time, the world was beginning to tilt into a period of intense cooling. As humans began to trickle out of Africa and into the Levant and eventually Europe and Northern Asia, they weren't walking into the world we see today. They were entering a landscape that was fundamentally hostile to their biology. In these early days, survival wasn't about clever inventions yet. It was about the raw, desperate limits of the human body. When you get cold, your body does something fascinating. It pulls blood away from your fingers and toes, shunting it toward your core to keep your heart and brain at a steady 98.6 degrees. This is why your hands go numb first. Your body is literally sacrificing your extremities to keep the engine running. But in a world where the sun might not provide real warmth for 6 months out of the year, that biological triage isn't enough. Our early ancestors had to find a way to create a portable version of the African sun. They had fire, of course, which they had been using for hundreds of thousands of years, but fire is stationary. You can't carry a bonfire with you while you're tracking a reindeer across a frozen tundra. But what happens when the fire isn't enough to bridge the gap between caves? For a long time, researchers believed that early humans just toughed it out with simple animal skins draped over their shoulders like heavy blankets. But recent archaeological breakthroughs have painted a much more sophisticated picture. Around 70,000 years ago, as the climate grew increasingly brutal, we see a shift in the way humans interacted with their environment. They stopped just wearing skins and started engineering them. This is the era of the first great technological revolution in human history, and it isn't made of stone or bronze. It's made of bone. At sites across Russia and Europe, archaeologists have found tiny, delicate bone needles dating back 30,000 to 40,000 years. This might seem like a small detail, but Dr. Ian Gilligan, a leading researcher in the archaeology of clothing, argues that the needle is perhaps the most significant invention in our history. Why? Because it allowed for fitted clothing. A draped skin still lets cold air circulate against the skin, a phenomenon called convective heat loss. But a sewn garment traps a layer of air against the body. That air is warmed by your body heat, creating a microclimate that moves with you. It's the difference between wearing a towel and wearing a high-tech winter parka. Could there be a reason why these tailored clothes changed more than just our comfort? The evidence suggests that this technology might be why Homo sapiens survived while our cousins, the Neanderthals, vanished. Neanderthals were actually better built for the cold than we were. They were stockier, with shorter limbs and larger nasal cavities to warm the freezing air before it hit their lungs. They had been in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before we arrived. Yet strangely, there is very little evidence that Neanderthals ever moved toward complex sewn clothing. They likely relied on their robust biology and simple capes. When the last glacial maximum hit, the absolute coldest point of the last ice age, that biological advantage wasn't enough. Homo sapiens, with our thin, weak bodies, had used the needle to create multi-layered thermal systems. At the Sungir site in Russia, researchers found burials of individuals from 30,000 years ago wearing trousers, shirts, and boots decorated with thousands of ivory beads. These weren't just scraps of fur, they were tailored suits designed to withstand temperatures that would drop to minus 40 degrees. We survived not because we were stronger, but because we were better at building a fake version of the tropics around our skin. But how do you protect the parts of the body that clothing can't fully cover, like the eyes and the lungs? As humans pushed further into the Mammoth Steppe, a vast frozen grassland that stretched from France to Alaska, they encountered a danger that many people today forget: snow blindness. The ultraviolet glare from a vast, treeless horizon of white can literally burn your retinas. Ancient hunters solved this by carving goggles out of bone or wood with tiny, narrow slits. This didn't just protect their eyes, it acted like a primitive camera obscura, sharpening their vision and allowing them to spot movement in the distance without being blinded by the sun. They also had to deal with the sheer caloric cost of staying warm. In a modern office, you might need 2,000 calories a day. In the heart of an Ice Age winter, a hunter-gatherer might burn 5,000 to 7,000 calories just to keep their internal furnace running. This meant that food wasn't just nutrition, it was fuel in a very literal thermal sense. They sought out the fattiest animals possible: mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant elk. Fat was the highest octane fuel available, providing the energy needed for non-shivering thermogenesis, a process where the body burns stored fat specifically to generate heat. Was there a way to store this life-saving fuel when the hunts were lean? This brings us to one of the most ingenious survival strategies of the deep past: the permafrost fridge. In places like modern-day Ukraine and Russia, the ground stays frozen year-round just a few inches below the surface. Ancient humans realized that if they dug pits into this frozen earth, they could store meat for months, effectively creating the world's first deep freezers. This allowed them to survive the hungry gap of late winter when the herds had migrated away. But even with food and clothing, you still need a place to sleep that won't turn into a tomb by morning. In areas where there were no caves and no trees to build wooden huts, our ancestors became architects of bone. At the Mezhyrik site in Ukraine, archaeologists discovered a series of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth remains. Imagine a house where the foundation is made of 95 mammoth mandibles stacked like bricks. The walls were made of massive leg bones, and the roof was a vaulted arch of tusks, covered in heavy hides and packed with moss. These weren't just piles of bone, they were highly engineered structures. But why would anyone choose to live in a house made of skulls? The answer lies in thermal mass. Bone and earth are excellent insulators. These mammoth bone houses were often built with cold trap entrances. The door was dug lower than the living floor. Because cold air is denser and heavier than warm air, it would sink into the entrance pit and stay there, while the warmth from a small central fire would rise and stay trapped in the living area. Even with a blizzard howling outside at 50 miles per hour, the inside of a mammoth bone hut could stay a relatively comfortable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't just survival, it was a settled, stable lifestyle in the middle of a frozen wasteland. These sites often show signs of being used for centuries. This suggests that these ancient humans didn't see winter as a catastrophe to be fled, but as a season they had mastered. They had the tools, the technology, and the architecture to wait out the ice. But what if the environment changes so fast that technology can't keep up? This is where we look at the quiet, invisible changes happening inside the human body itself. Not all of our survival was based on tools. Some of it was written into our DNA. About 50,000 years ago, a group of humans interbred with a mysterious, now extinct cousin species known as the Denisovans. From this union, some humans inherited a specific variant of a gene called EPAS1. Today, this gene is famously found in Tibetans, allowing them to thrive in high-altitude environments with low oxygen. But research suggests that these kinds of genetic gifts were also crucial for surviving the extreme cold of the north. Some ancient lineages developed a higher proportion of brown fat. Unlike the white fat most of us have today, brown fat is packed with mitochondria. Its sole purpose is to burn calories to generate heat directly without the need for shivering. It's like having a built-in electric blanket. There's also evidence that our circulatory systems adapted. Some northern populations developed a more efficient hunting response, where blood vessels in the hands and feet periodically dilate and constrict to keep the tissues alive without draining too much heat from the core. Does this mean that our ancestors were fundamentally different animals than we are today? Not exactly. They were us, just pushed to the absolute limit. And that limit sometimes led to strategies that sound like something out of a science fiction novel. In 2020, researchers Antonis Bartsiokas and Juan Luis Arzuaga published a startling study in the journal L'Anthropologie. They examined the bones of early human ancestors from a site in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, which dates back about 400,000 years. They found evidence of seasonal bone lesions and growth disruptions that are identical to the patterns seen in hibernating animals like cave bears. The researchers proposed a controversial theory that during the most brutal peaks of the ice ages, some ancient human groups may have actually entered a state of hibernation. They would retreat into deep caves, their metabolisms would slow to a crawl, and they would essentially sleep through the worst months of the year, living off their fat stores. While this theory is still heavily debated, it highlights just how desperate the situation was. Whether or not they truly hibernated, the fact that scientists are even discussing it shows the extreme measures required to survive a world where the sun felt like a distant memory. But how did they handle the mental toll of the long dark? We often talk about the physical struggle, but the psychological challenge of an ice age winter was just as deadly. For months on end, your world would be reduced to a tiny, flickering circle of firelight inside a hut made of bones. Outside, there is only the wind and the dark. To survive this, humans leaned on the one thing that no other species had: complex social narratives. This is the era where we see the explosion of cave art and portable carvings. These weren't just decorations, they were the social glue that kept a tribe together when they were trapped indoors for weeks. By sharing stories, creating rituals, and carving intricate figures, they maintained a sense of purpose and connection. They weren't just waiting for the sun to come back, they were building a culture that made the waiting bearable. We find flutes made of vulture bones dating back 35,000 years. Think about that. In the middle of the most brutal climate the human race has ever seen, someone took the time to figure out how to make music. They understood that you don't just survive with calories and fur, you survive with hope and community. But did this social closeness have a darker side when the food finally ran out? The archaeological record is a silent witness to the most desperate moments of our history. At various sites across Europe, such as the Goyet Caves in Belgium, researchers have found human bones with the same butcher marks as the reindeer and horse bones found nearby. When the permafrost fridges were empty and the herds didn't return, our ancestors sometimes turned to the only source of protein left. Cannibalism wasn't a cultural preference. It was a grim, final tactical choice in a war of attrition. It reminds us that for all the cleverness of the bone needle and the mammoth bone house, there were winters that were simply stronger than we were. There were lineages that ended in those caves, whole branches of the human family tree that were snuffed out by a cold that wouldn't break. Every person alive today is the descendant of the ones who didn't reach that breaking point, the ones who had just enough fat, just enough luck, and just enough help from their neighbors to see the first green shoots of spring. What happened to those skills when the ice finally began to retreat about 12,000 years ago? As the world warmed, the mammoth steppe vanished. The vast grasslands were replaced by dense forests, and the mammoths themselves went extinct. The great bone cities were abandoned. We moved from being masters of the ice to being architects of the soil. We invented agriculture, built permanent stone cities, and eventually developed the technology to ignore the seasons entirely. We moved the fire from the center of the hut into pipes in our walls. We replaced the hand-sewn furs with synthetic fabrics made in factories. We became so good at surviving winter that we turned it into a luxury. We go to ski resorts to play in the very environment that once tried to erase us from the earth. We have lived in this warm, comfortable interglacial period for so long that we've forgotten that the ice is the historical norm for our species, not the exception. For most of the last 200,000 years, the Earth has been a much colder place than it is today. But could the very tricks we used to survive the ice be the things that haunt us now? Our bodies are still tuned for the Ice Age. We have a biological drive to seek out high-calorie fats and sugars because, for 99% of our history, that was the only way to not freeze to death. Today, in a world of infinite calories and central heating, that same drive leads to obesity and heart disease. Our brown fat is disappearing because we never experienced the kind of prolonged cold that triggers its growth. We are living in tropical bodies, in a tropical environment of our own making, but with the survival software of an Ice Age hunter still running in the background. We are the survivors of a world that no longer exists, and our modern health problems are, in a sense, the price we pay for winning the war against the winter so completely. We are victims of our own success, drifting further and further away from the raw, physical reality that forged us. But how long can we keep the cold at bay? We think of the Ice Age as a prehistoric event, something that happened to people with spears and leather clothes. But geologically speaking, we are still in an ice age. We are just in a brief, warm hiccup called an interglacial. The glaciers are currently in retreat, but the cycle of the Earth's tilt and orbit, the Milankovitch cycles, dictate that eventually the ice will return. Whether that happens in 5,000 years or 50,000 years, the deadly winter is a recurring character in the story of our planet. When it returns, our current infrastructure will be as useless as a Neanderthal's simple cape. Our power grids, our global supply chains, and our glass-walled cities are not built for the weight of 2 miles of ice. We will be forced to return to the lessons of the bone needle and the mammoth hut. We will have to remember how to be the animal that doesn't just endure the cold, but uses it to become something more. Is it possible that we are actually losing the very qualities that made us successful in the first place? In our quest for comfort, we have sacrificed our resilience. The ancient humans at Mezhirish or Sungir didn't just survive. They were part of their environment. They understood the physics of heat, the chemistry of animal fats, and the biology of their own bodies in a way that we have completely outsourced to machines. If the power went out tomorrow and stayed out, most of us wouldn't know how to sew a seam that keeps out the wind. We wouldn't know which part of a carcass provides the fuel for our internal furnace. We have traded our deep ancestral knowledge for a thermostat on the wall. We think we have conquered nature, but we have really just built a very elaborate cage to keep it out, and every cage eventually rusts. But perhaps the most important legacy of those ancient winters isn't the technology, but the way it shaped our minds. The need to prepare for a winter that could last for decades forced us to think into the future. It rewarded the planners, the storytellers, and the innovators. It made us a species that looks at a pile of bones and sees a palace. It made us a species that looks at a frozen wasteland and sees a home. That's the real reason you're here today. It's not just because your ancestor had a warm coat. It's because they had the imagination to believe that spring was coming, even when they hadn't seen a green leaf in 6 months. That's a powerful kind of magic, a mental armor that is just as important as any fur or fire. When you feel that tiny shiver tonight, don't just think of it as a cold draft. Think of it as a signal. It's your body reminding you of who you are and where you came from. It's a message from the mammoth steppe, a reminder that you are the product of the most successful survival story in the history of the world. You are the one who made it through. As we look at the vast timeline of our species, we see a pattern of escalating challenges and ingenious responses. From the first fire in Africa to the first needle in Siberia to the first bone hut in Ukraine, we have spent 200 millennia proving that we can outthink the climate. We have taken the most hostile environments on Earth and turned them into the cradle of our civilization. But as we move forward into an uncertain future, we have to ask ourselves if we are still that same species. Are we still the clever, resilient architects of our own survival, or have we become too soft for the world we inhabit? The ice will eventually return, and the stories we tell ourselves in the dark will once again be the only thing keeping us warm. We must hope that when that day comes, we still remember how to listen to the ghosts of our past. Because the cold doesn't care about our technology or our politics. It only cares about the physics of heat and the will to survive. Think back to that quiet, mundane observation we started with, the simple shiver after a shower. It feels so small, so insignificant in our modern lives. But it is the thread that connects you to the hunters at the edge of the glaciers. It is a biological testament to a time when every breath was a victory and every night was a gamble. It is a reminder that you are never truly alone in the dark. You carry the warmth of 10,000 generations of survivors inside your very cells. They are there in your brown fat, in your EPAS1 genes, and in your drive to build a home and tell a story. They are the reason you can look at the winter sky and feel wonder instead of terror. You are the heir to a kingdom of ice, a master of the frost who has forgotten his own crown. But there is one final thing to consider before you turn up the heat and settle in for the night. We like to think of our survival as a completed journey, a mountain we've already climbed. We look at the ancient humans as primitive, as people who were just starting out on the long road to us. But in the reality of deep time, they were the ones at the peak of their game. They were the ones who faced the full, unmitigated fury of the planet with nothing but bone and brain, and they didn't blink. They lived in a world where nature was a god that could crush you in an afternoon, and they found a way to dance with it. We are the ones living in the quiet after party, enjoying the warmth they fought for. We should be careful not to mistake our current comfort for a permanent victory. The Earth is a restless cycling system, and the balance of heat and cold is a delicate thing. The story of how we survived the deadly winters of the past isn't just a history lesson. It's a blueprint. It shows us that when things are at their darkest and coldest, humans don't just curl up and die. We invent. We cooperate. We create beauty in the middle of the desolation. We turn the bones of our problems into the walls of our shelters. That's the DNA of our species, and it's a legacy we should be proud to carry. So the next time you feel that tiny, involuntary shiver, don't just reach for a blanket. Take a second to feel the strength behind it. Feel the echoes of the mammoth hunters and the bone needle stitchers. Feel the weight of 200,000 years of survival pressing against your skin. You are a tropical animal that learned how to haunt the ice. The ice is not gone. It is only waiting.